Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for Mark and myself to discuss that this cost recovery model, from our point of view, is dead, and it's simply based on the principle which we all learn as children in relation to money. You shall not spend more money than you have. The only sector I know where this principle is not valid is air navigation services. In contrary, for an ANSP, the principle is no matter how much you spend, your customer, Jeff, will pay for it. Let me state 5 reasons for Mark and myself why the full cost recovery regime needs to be substituted by a more performance-oriented regime. The first, full cost recovery reinforces cycle. The full cost recovery system, with its adjustment mechanism in Europe, often the short-term N+2 system, called, intensifies the cycle effect. Only a few states have reserves that can be used to offset fluctuations in user charges. Possible reasons for this are because they collide with principles governing user charges, the accrual basis, and they are not desired by the users, based on, for instance, financing investments preferable. Users have greatly benefited from this in times of high traffic growth. Everybody knows that. From a long-term perspective, this system of full cost recovery is neither of advantage nor of disadvantage to users. Due to the nature of the system, however, fluctuations in charges occur at the wrong time. We see it clearly in the present economic crisis, and that has been discussed and presented this morning, and everybody knows it, which we all have to face the challenge to cope with the expected under-recoveries. Second thesis is there are no system-related incentives to promote cost-effective actions. Due to the fact that the company can make no profits on user charges, and apart from the prescribed return on equity, it has no incentive to improve its performance. This means that there is no scope to reward companies that have good performance records. The third one is the lack of potential to exert pressure on labor unions. And it was a remarkable presentation this morning by Greg from Australia, how to deal with that. And everybody knows how the individual ANSPs is dealing with their unions by negotiating different aspects. And arguments based on the economic situation of the company are tenuous given the fact that it is the customers who have to bear all economic consequences. In one of my personal negotiations with the union, they made the statement, it costs what it costs, full stop. The fourth recovery principle is the unbalance in the regulatory policies among the various stakeholders of the ATM industry, where the airlines and the airports have already been liberalized. ATM by far not. And finally, cost recovery hinders the institutional progress of our business. Let me quickly review what are the characteristics of ATC, and everybody knows that firstly, by nature, ATC is a monopoly. We discussed that several times. No market exists. There can only be a competition for the control of airspaces, if at all, and not for the control in an airspace. Therefore, the ANSPs have no influence over the volume, which is the second argument, of air traffic to be controlled, given the fact that ANS costs constitutes as little as 3 to 5% of the total costs of airlines. The air navigation services are low down on the list of factors for airlines when choosing flight routes or deciding whether to fly at all. Second, the capital expenditure in air navigation services is very long. Knut mentioned that this morning. All capital expenditure in air navigation services requires a much longer lead time and has a considerably longer useful life than is in case in other industries. Planning and implementation of capital expenditures in ATM infrastructure often takes 10 years or even more. Hiring and recruiting controllers, we learned that this morning as Knut presented that, takes 3 to 4 years. So there is no really reason in a very long-term raising. So then the question, what are the consequences of departing from full cost recovery? Very simple, it's a risk of change in traffic, the cost risk, and the financing risk, and a risk supplement would have to be factored into the charge from ANSP's point of view. Then the charge once more would increase. This, however, as we heard this morning by Jeff as well, is unlikely to happen considering the aforementioned lack of marketability and the resources, the long lead times for capital expenditures, and the predominantly public law structure of ANSPs. So what, ladies and gentlemen, might be the possible solutions? The first thing is transferring some risks to ANSPs. And that could be one possible solution by transferring cost risk to the ANSPs while the risk of change in traffic volume remains with the airlines. This would take the shape of a long-term contract under which the airlines would agree to avail of a certain volume of ATC services. Limiting the risks for ANSPs if, for example, the risk of change in traffic is transferred to the ANSPs, then the resulting variations could be capped and floored. Several times happen in an economic regulation. And in any case, but a risk premium would have to be included into the charge. Then promoting incentives while maintaining the full cost recovery system. It would be conceivable to promote more incentives for management to achieve cost targets. So, conclusion, when considering a departure from the principle of full cost recovery, ideal solutions will only be conceivable if the regulator is prepared, and in the worst case, to allow an ANSP to die, so to speak. If this is not the case, as it is my impression, then at some stage the risks will always be transferred back to the airlines. This also limits the pressure that can be exerted, for example, on labor unions, as we discussed it this morning. Transferring the cost risk to the ANSPs is a suitable way to introduce principles that are at least somewhat market-oriented. That means I have to close. The selected system must be compatible with the ATC business model, and therefore, I'm pretty sure the traditional cost recovery model is dead. Thank you very much.